autumn of 1873, when the fogs of Suffolk grew thick enough to muffle church, bells and dampen even the sharpest cries of rooks at dusk, a boy of no more than 10 appeared on the gravel drive of Blackfeather Manor barefoot, and shivering beneath a threadbare coat far too large for his narrow frame. He carried nothing but a burlap sack, its contents clinking faintly with each step, though, when the housekeeper, Mrs. Elmsworth, later examined it, she found only smooth river stones and a tarnished thimble curiously warm to the touch, despite the chill. The boy gave his name as Elias, though whether it was surname or Christian name he never clarified, nor did anyone press him. In those days, orphans were as common as crows after harvest, unless remarked upon Blackfeather, a long-neglected estate nestled in a crook of the River Auld, where the willows leaned inward as if guarding secrets, had stood half-empty since the death of Sir Alistair Blackwood 3 winters. Prior a man known less for his lineage than for his peculiar silence in the locked east wing that no servant dared enter. His widow, Lady Eleanor, frail, and retreating into widow's weeds like a moth into shadow, had taken to bed with nerves and granted the boy shelter not out of charity, but because, as she confided to her physician, his eyes remind me of the silence before Thundock. At first, Elias was unobtrusive, a ghost in the scullery, polishing silver no one used, stacking firewood with hands too small for the task, yet never complaining. The staff, a skeletal remnant of the manor's former grandeur, regarded him with the wary indifference reserved for stray things that might vanish as quietly as they came. Yet within weeks, the villagers of Little Folly began to whisper. It started with Mrs. Hargrave, the sexton's wife, who swore she saw the boy near the churchyard one twilight, kneeling not in prayer, but in ritualistic arrangement of pebbles around a fresh grave, that of old Mr. Craythorne, the tanner buried just 3 days prior. When questioned, Elias claimed he'd only been gathering moss for Lady Eleanor's medicinal tea, but Mrs. Hargrave insisted. The stones formed a crude circle, and atop the headstone perched a single crow, unnaturally still, its obsidian affixed not on the boy, but on the church spire, as though awaiting a signal. Then came the disappearances. Not of people, but of objects, small, intimate things. A widow's locket, left on a pew, a child's carved wooden horse from a garden bench, a pair of spectacles tucked inside a hymnal. Each vanished, without force, without sin of intrusion, as though plucked gently from the world by invisible fingers. Suspicion that blooming vine coiled toward the orphan. Yet when Constable Pembleton searched Elias's pallet in the coal cellar, he found nothing but folded rags and a collection of dried rose hips. Still, the crows multiplied. Where once a dozen birds might gather in the manor's skeletal oaks, now scores descended at dawn and dusk, their calls less raucous than deliberate, a low, guttural chorus that seemed to echo the rhythm of a ticking clock. Lady Eleanor, who had begun taking laudanum with her tea, claimed she heard them speaking in her dreams. Not words, but names, her husband's name, repeated like a tolling bell. What unsettled the household most was not Elias's presence, but his absence. He would vanish for entire days, returning with mud-caked knees and pockets heavy with twigs, feathers, and once, alarmingly, a child's porcelain doll's hand, its fingers curled as if in supplication. When the cook asked where he'd been, he merely pointed east toward the marshes and said, "Feeding." No one asked what. The birds followed him like acolytes, landing on his shoulders without fear, pecking not at his skin but at the air around him, as though consuming something invisible. Servants began locking their doors at night, though none admitted why. Even the dog's 2 aging mastiffs, who once patrolled the grounds with lazy authority, would cower in their kennels when Elias passed, tails tucked, eyes wide with something akin to recognition. Then, in late November, the first snow fell, thin and mournful, dusting the manor's slate roofs and silencing the usual groans of the old timbers. That morning Lady Eleanor was found in the conservatory, slumped in her wicker chair, her teacup shattered beside her, her gaze fixed on the glass panes through which a murder of crows stared inward. Motionless, she spoke only once more before her mind retreated entirely. He is feeding them more than bread. Within the week, she was confined to her chambers, tended by a nervous nurse from Ipswich who refused to stay past dusk. Elias, meanwhile, grew quieter. His movements more deliberate, his eyes darker as if something within him had settled into place, and in the village the graves began to shift. Not disturbed, not dug open, but subtly altered. Headstones tilted at unnatural angles, soil softened as though recently turned, and always a scattering of black feathers at the foot of each plot, arranged not randomly, but with geometric precision, as if marking a map only the dead could read. It was then that the letters began to arrive anonymous, inked in a spidery hand on paper that smelled faintly of damp earth. They were addressed not to any living resident of Blackfeather, but to Sir Alister himself, care of his final resting place in the family crypt. The postmaster, uneasier, delivered them to the manor anyway, and there they sat for days on the hall table, unopened, until Elias, with no explanation, took them one by one and carried them into the woods. Villagers later claimed to have seen the envelopes burning in a shallow stone bowl, the flames green at their core, while the crows circled above in perfect silence, a silence so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. No one dared retrieve the ashes, and no one, not even the vicar, would enter the churchyard after nightfall. For in those hours when the wind stilled and the river fog coiled like smoke through the yew trees, a new sound could be heard. Not a cry, not a rustle, but the soft rhythmic tap of small fingers against cold marble, as though counting the names of the newly buried one by one. The first documented inquiry into the events at Blackfeather Manor arrived not from the local nor the county magistrate, but from an unexpected quartermass Augustorne, a correspondent for the Illustrated London Gazette, whose dispatches on rural folklore and ecclesiastical anomalies had earned her a quiet reputation among the literate circles of Bloomsbury. She arrived in Little Fawley in early January of 1874, cloaked in sealskin, and carrying a leather-bound notebook whose pages were already half-filled with marginal sketches of crow formations and transcriptions of local dialects. Interest, she claimed to the innkeeper at the Crooked Spire, was merely anthropological, a study of mourning customs in isolated parishes. Yet those who observed her long walks along the riverbank noted how often her gaze drifted toward the manor's eastern where the windows of the sealed wing remained shuttered even in daylight, their glass filmed with decades of grime, and something darker patches of mold that, according to the gardener's boy, grew overnight in the shape of grasping hands. Miss Thorne's first visit to Blackfeather was granted through the reluctant intercession of Dr. Langford, Lady Eleanor's physician, who feared the widow's mental state might deteriorate without external stimulation. The house, Miss Thorne later wrote in a private memorandum now held in the archives of the Society for Psychical Research, breathed like a slumbering animal, each creak of floorboard a sigh, each draught a whispered exhale. She was shown to the drawing-room, where embers smouldered in the grate, though no fire had been lit that morning. Elias, summoned from the stables, entered without sound, his boots leaving no mark on the Turkish rug. He did not speak, but when Miss Thorne asked if he liked the crows, he tilted his head not in confusion, but as if listening to something beyond the walls, and replied, "They remember what people forget." The phrase, simple yet unnerving in its cadence, was recorded verbatim in her journal, alongside a meticulous description of his eyes, not black, as one might expect, but a pale, washed-out gray, like river stones seen through deep water. Over the following fortnight, Miss Thorne became a frequent, almost spectral presence at the manor. She took tea with Lady Eleanor, whose lucid moments grew rarer but more intense, often centered on her late husband's obsession with the old ways, a vague reference that, when pressed, dissolved into trembling silence. Miss Thorne interviewed the staff, though a few would speak plainly. The butler, Mr. Greaves, admitted only that Sir Alister had once kept a locked cabinet in the library containing books not meant for Christian eyes, which had vanished after his death. The cook, Mrs. Bales, whispered of hearing footsteps in the east wing long after it had been bolted shut, footsteps that always ended at the door to the nursery, a room unused since the stillbirth of the Blackwood's only child in 1859. Most telling, however, was the testimony of young Tom Pritchard, the stable lad, who swore he'd seen Elias at dawn, standing neat in the churchyard mud, placing silver thimbles and hairpins into the open beaks of waiting crows. "They didn't fly off," Tom insisted. "They swallowed them slow." Like communion, it was Miss Thorne who first connected the stolen objects to specific graves. Cross-referencing parish records with the villagers' missing trinkets, she compiled a list that chilled even her skeptical editor when she later submitted her draft. Each item corresponded precisely to a burial within the past 6 months. The locket to Mrs. Fenwick, the tanner's widow, the wooden horse to Timothy Croft, a boy who'd drowned in the old. The spectacles, too. Old Parson Heedle, Wassace, had grown increasingly apocalyptic before his sudden collapse. More disturbingly, every stolen object had been a personal token placed on or near the coffin during the funeralums, meant to accompany the dead into the next world. And now they were being fed to birds. Miss Thorne's investigation led her to the manor's library, where, beneath a loose floorboard near the hearth, she discovered a slim journal bound in black calfskin, its pages brittle with age and annotated in Sir Alister's precise hand. The entries, spanning the years 1858 to 1860, began as scholarly notes on Anglo-Saxon burial rites, but soon veered into more obscure territory references to the Watchers in the Branches, a folkloric entity mentioned in regional as intermediaries between the living and the dead, sustained not by flesh, but by memory. According to the journal, these watchers manifesting as crows could be appeased or enlisted through the offering of tokens of remembrance, thereby ensuring the deceased's peaceful passage. But if the offerings ceased, or were withheld, the watchers would grow restless, and their hunger would turn inward, feeding, not on objects, but on the memories of the living, erasing names, faces, even love itself, until the bereaved became hollow shells whispering to graves that no longer held meaning. The final entry, dated October 12, 1860, was scrawled in haste, the ink blotted as if by trembling fingers. "Eleanor insists we stop. She says the birds follow her in dreams, pecking at her thoughts. But if we cease, what becomes of little William? His soul is so thinned. Needs anchoring. The watchers demand continuity. One must feed them always, or they feed on us. Below this, someone, perhaps Lady Eleanor, perhaps another hand had added in faint pencil. He found a boy in the marshes, said the crows led him there. The boy has no past. That is why he is perfect." Miss Thorne spent 3 nights transcribing the journal by candlelight, her breath visible in the unheated library, the only sound the scratching of her nib and, occasionally, the soft tap of beaks against the window-pane. She never mentioned whether she saw anything outside, only that she locked the shutters thereafter, and began carrying a small silver cross pinned inside her collar. Her letters to London grew increasingly coded, filled with references to a via intermediarius and Nimanac sacrifice, phrases her editor dismissed as poetic flourish. Yet in her private notes, she wrote, "There is no madness here, only a terrible logic, preserved like a pinned specimen under glass." And then, on the morning of February 3rd, she vanished from her room at the Crooked Spire, Labine Benain, her notebook open to a sketch of Blackfeather Manor, its roofline thick with crows, and in the margin, a single sentence underlined twice. "He doesn't feed them to keep the dead quiet. He feeds them to keep the dead remembered." The disappearance of Miss Agnes Thorne sent a tremor through Little Folly that no official inquiry could still. The local constable filed a perfunctory report, citing likely misadventure in the marshes, yet even he avoided the manor's lane after dusk. And when questioned by a Gazette editor dispatched from London, he refused to meet the man's eyes. The editor himself, a brisk man named Pettigrew, with little patience for country superstition, spent 2 days at Blackfeather, interviewing staff, examining the guest room where Miss Thorne had stayed, and demanding access to the East Wing. Lady Eleanor, now rarely coherent, was wheeled into the morning room by her nurse. She stared at Pettigrew as though he were a ghost, and murmured. She asked too many questions of the silence. Elias, when summoned, stood by the window, watching a pair of crows preen on the frost-rimmed ballast. When Pettigrew pressed him about Miss Thorne's last hours, the boy turned slowly, and said only, "She wanted to hear what the graves say. But the dead don't speak. They sing." Pettigrew left that afternoon. His notes sparse, his collar damp with sweat, despite the cold, and the Gazette quietly dropped the story. Yet the pattern persisted, deepening like a bruise beneath the skin of the village. Graves continued to yield subtle disturbances, not violations, but a sprig of yew placed where none had grown, a child's shoe, impossibly dry, nestled beside a headstone, and always the crows more numerous, their silence more profound. They no longer cawed at dawn. Instead, they gathered in the churchyard at precisely 3:17 a.m., according to the sexton's pocket watch, and remained motionless until first light, as though keeping vigil for something unseen. Villagers began avoiding the burial ground altogether, opting to lay their dead in the newer cemetery near the railway cutting, though even there, feathers appeared by morning, black as ink, laid with unnerving care upon fresh earth. What truly unsettled the parish was the recurrence of names. In the spring of 1874, young Martha Henshaw, feverish with influenza, was heard calling out in her sleep, not for her mother, but for Elias and William, the latter name unknown to her family. When questioned upon recovery, she claimed no memory of the utterance, yet described a dream in which a boy with gray eyes showed her a room filled with shelves of glass jars, each containing a feather and a whisper. Around the same time, the schoolmaster noted that 3 children, unconnected by kinship, had independently drawn the same image in their copybooks: a manor with a crooked spire, surrounded by birds whose wings form the shape of hands. Most disturbingly, Reverend Mallory discovered, during a routine inventory of church records, that the entry for William Blackwood's stillbirth bore a marginal annotation in ink that matched none of the parish pens. Not gone. Waiting, the handwriting, when compared privately by a London graphologist retained by a concerned relative, matched fragments found in Miss Thorne's abandoned notebook. The manor itself seemed to absorb time. Servants reported clocks running backward in the west corridor. Mirrors in the upstairs halls reflected figures who were not there or were tarry, but turned away just as one approached. Lady Eleanor, in a rare moment of clarity, confessed to Dr. Langford that she sometimes heard a lullaby drifting from the nursery, though no one had entered that room in 15 years. "It's the same tune Alistair used to hum," she whispered, but slower, as if sung underwater. Dr. Langford, a rational man trained at Edinburgh, dismissed it as auditory hallucination, yet he began taking notes in a separate ledger, one he kept locked in his medical bag. In it, he recorded anomalies that defied his training: soil samples from the churchyard that emitted faint warmth, crow feathers that resisted burning, curling instead into ashless spirals, and, most a pocket watch retrieved from the riverbank, graved with Miss Thorne's initials that kept perfect time despite being submerged for weeks, its chime sounding not on the hour, but at 3:17 a.m. Elias, meanwhile, grew more withdrawn, yet his influence expanded. He no longer worked in the scullery or stable, but spent his days in the overgrown walled garden, tending to nothing visible. Yet the roses there bloomed out of season, their petals black at the edges. He was seen placing small objects into the hollow of an ancient UAA hair ribbon, a rusted key, a glass marble clouded with age. Villagers who glimpsed him from afar swore the crows watched him not with animal instinct, but with something like reverence. One evening, the postmaster's daughter glimpsed him standing before the Blackwood crypt, arms outstretched, as dozens of birds settled upon him like a living shroud. When she told her father, he forbade her from speaking of it again. Yet that night, he nailed shut the window overlooking the churchyard. The final catalyst came not from the living, but from the dead. In June, a shallow grave near the river bank collapsed after heavy rains, revealing not bones, but a child's coffin, unmarked, lined with crow feathers and filled with trinkets stolen over the past year-old, meticulously arranged around a single object, a porcelain doll's hand, its fingers closed around a lock of fine, pale hair. The sexton, upon identifying the items, collapsed with shock. Among them was Miss Thorne's silver cross, now blackened, and Lady Eleanor's wedding brooch, missing since the previous winter. The constable ordered the coffin reburied at once, but not before Dr. Langford made a silent sketch of its contents. In his ledger, he wrote, "The offerings are no longer just for the dead. They are becoming the dead." And that night, for the first time, the crows did not return to the manor. They gathered instead on the roof of the church, their eyes fixed, not eastward, but inward, toward the village, toward the homes, toward the beds where the living tried not to listen for the sound of small feet on the stairs. By the autumn of 1875, Blackfeather Manor had become less a residence than a monument to quiet dread. Its gates rusted shut, its gardens choked with ivy that seemed to grow toward the windows rather than the sun. Lady Eleanor, confined to a single room on the ground floor, received no visitors save Dr. Langford and, occasionally, a gaunt-faced solicitor from Ipswich who came not to discuss estates, but to retrieve letters that arrived still, addressed in that same sepulchral hand, now increasingly legible, as though the sender had grown accustomed to the act of writing from beyond. Elias remained, though he was rarely seen. Servants claimed he slept in the stables or the root cellar, yet his presence was felt in the meticulous order of the untouched silver, the swept hearths, the bowls of milk left nightly on the back step. 4 cats, but for the crows, who drank in solemn rotation, one by one, as if partaking in a sacrament. It was during this period of eerie stasis that Mr. Edmund Vale entered the narrative not as an official investigator, but as a private scholar of obscure antiquities, drawn by rumors whispered in the reading rooms of the British Museum. Bali, then in his early 40s, was a man of quiet intensity, trained in both archaeology and comparative mythology, and possessed of a peculiar sensitivity to what he termed residual atmospheres, the lingering imprints of intense emotion upon plays. He had read fragments of Miss Thorne's unpublished notes, passed to him by a sympathetic editor after her disappearance, and recognized in them patterns that echoed older, darker traditions, the Norse practice of seer, the Slavic veneration of the raven god Vels, and, most pertinently, a near-forgotten East Anglian custom known as soul-binding, wherein the memory of the departed was preserved through ritual offerings to intermediary spirits, lest their essence dissolve into nothingness. Vale arrived in Little Fawley under the guise of cataloguing ecclesiastical artifacts for a county history, but his true purpose soon became evident to those who watched him. He spent days in the parish archives, cross-referencing burial records, with meteorological logs, noting that the disturbances at Blackfeather coincided not with anniversaries, but with specific lunar phases and atmospheric conditions, particularly when fog blanketed the river and the air grew heavy with static. He interviewed elderly villagers who recalled, with lowered voices, that Sir Alister's grandfather had once been accused of unnatural communions. After a plague of crows descended upon his flocks during the cholera outbreak of 1832, most crucially, Bali obtained through means never disclosed access to Dr. Langford's private ledger, from which he transcribed the descriptions of the anomalous soil and the coffin found by the river. His breakthrough came not from documents, but from sound. One October evening, drawn by the absence of birdsong, Vale crept through the manor's overgrown holly hedge and stood beneath a nursery window. There, beneath the sigh of the wind, he heard it, a faint, wordless melody, neither sung nor played, but resonating as if from the timbers themselves. It matched no known tune, yet it bore the cadence of a lullaby, slow, repetitive, achingly mournful. He returned the next night with a tuning fork and a wax cylinder, and though the recording captured only wind and distant water, his notes describe a sensation. The air vibrated not with music, but with longing frequency of absence. Vale's obsession deepened with the subtlety of a spreading stain. He took rooms at the Crooked Spire, but rarely slept, instead pacing the riverbank with a lantern, mapping the locations where feathers had been found. He corresponded with linguists about the etymology of Blackfeather, discovering that in pre-Norman dialects the name derived not from plumage, but from Blackfeather Darkfather, a euphemism for the underworld guide. He visited the church crypt and, by lamplight, examined the Blackwood vault, noting that Sir Alister's coffin bore faint scratches on its inner lid, horizontal, rhythmic, as though made by fingernails over many nights. Most Tellingly, Vale began to experience what he termed mnemonic echoes, waking with phrases in his mind that he had never read, names he had never heard, and, once, the vivid sensation of holding a child's hand that was not there. His journal, recovered years later from a locked drawer in his London study, reveals a mind teetering between scholarly rigor and haunted intuition. "The boy is not feeding the crows," he wrote in a trembling hand. "He is feeding the silence between the living and the dead. Each object returned to the earth via the birds is a thread pulled from the veil, and the more threads removed, the thinner the veil becomes." He became convinced that William Blackwood had not died at birth, but had been taken not by illness, but designed into a liminal state, sustained by the continuous offering of memory. Elias, he theorized, was not a random orphan, but a vessel, a child born without a past, and therefore capable of channeling the past of others. The crows were not mere birds, but psychic conduits, their consumption of tokens a form of mnemonic transference. In late November, Vale gained entry to the East Wing. How he bypassed the rusted locks remains unclear. The butler, Mr. Greaves, claimed he found the door ajar one morning, as though someone or something had invited him in. Inside, Vale discovered not decay, but preservation. A nursery, frozen in time, dustless, untouched by mildew, the crib still made with fine linen, a music box on the dresser wound tight but silent. On the wall hung a portrait of Sir Alister and Lady Eleanor, but the space where a child should have stood was blanket when Vale examined it under angled light. He saw the faintest outline of a small figure, as though painted over with great care. Beneath the floorboards, he found a hidden compartment containing a child's baptismal gown, a lock of pale hair tied with black thread, and a single crow feather inscribed with a date, October 12, 1859, the day William was said to have died. That night, Vale did not return to the inn. He was found at dawn in the churchyard, kneeling before the Blackwood crypt, his hands clutching a small wooden box filled with trinkets, Miss Thorne's pen nib, a child's button, Lady Eleanor's thimble. His eyes were open, unblinking, fixed on the eastern sky. He spoke only once before collapsing. "He's not keeping them remembered. He's keeping them here." Dr. Langford diagnosed a nervous collapse, but the villagers knew better. They saw how the crows followed Vale's carriage to the train station, how they perched on the signal gantry until the tracks fell silent. And they noticed, in the days after, that Elias no longer walked alone. Sometimes, in the fog, two figures could be seen by the river, one small, one slender, feeding something into the water that glittered like forgotten names. The winter of 1876 arrived with a stillness so profound it seemed the world itself held its breath. Snow fell, not in flakes, but in veils, muffling the lanes of Little Fawley until even the church bell sounded as though wrapped in wool. Blackfeather Manor, now entirely abandoned by servants save for the spectral presence of Elias, stood like a stone tooth in a pale jaw, its windows reflecting nothing but sky and the occasional arc of black wings. Lady Eleanor had passed quietly in her sleep the previous December, her hands folded over a locket that, when opened, contained not a portrait, but a single crow feather-bound with silver wire. Her burial was attended by fewer than a dozen souls, all of whom left before the sexton finished, filling the grave none, wishing to be caught. Outdoors when dusk bled into that hour, when time frayed at the edges. It was in this hushed interlude that the final revelation emerged, not through discovery, but through absence. Mr. Vale, though physically recovered, had withdrawn from public life, retreating to a cottage on the Cornish coast, where he spent his remaining years, compiling a manuscript he titled On Mnemonic a work never published, its only surviving copy now locked in a lead-lined box at the Royal Anthropological Institute. Yet before his departure, he left behind one last act of quiet defiance. A sealed envelope, addressed to no one, deposited with the vicar of Little Fawley, with instructions to open it only when the crows ceased to come. The vicar, Reverend Malloryby, then an old man with failing eyes and a conscience, heavy with secrets, waited 7 years before breaking the wax. Inside, he found not a confession, but a drawing, a detailed plan of Blackfeather Manor's east wing, with annotations in Vale's precise hand. One room, labeled nursery, bore an asterisk, and the phrase, "Not a chamber for the living, but a vessel for the undeadened." Beneath it, in smaller script, "They do not haunt because they cannot leave. They stay because they are fed." The drawing also revealed what no one had noticed before. Nursery shared a wall with a family crypt, and between them ran a narrow flue, long bricked over but still visible in the manor's original blueprints. Vale theorized that Sir Alistair, in his grief, had engineered a conduit through which offerings could pass from the realm of the living to the threshold of the dead. The trinkets were never meant for the crows alone. The birds were merely couriers, carrying tokens down through the chimney, flew into the sealed crypt below, where they accumulated around the coffin of his son, not as grave goods, but as anchors. Each object whispered a memory, and each memory tethered William's spirit to the world, not in torment, but in suspension of state, neither alive nor dead, but waiting. Elias, found starving in the marshes the winter after William's stillbirth, had been chosen not for his silence, but for his emptiness, a boy with no history to obscure the echoes of another. His feeding of the crows was not superstition, but intense daily ritual to keep the veil porous, the threshold open, the sun not gone. But held on, no one ever confirmed whether William's body rested in the Blackwood crypt. When the estate was finally sold in 1881 to a textile magnate with no interest in ghosts, the new owner ordered the east wing demolished. Workers reported strange resistance in the nursery wall, bricks that crumbled to dust at a touch, mortar that smelled of damp earth and roses, and, in the space behind the hearth, a small hollow lined with hundreds of feathers, each threaded with a sliver of silver, a fragment of lace, or a chip of porcelain, every stolen token preserved like relics. The foreman, a pragmatic man from Birmingham, ordered it all burned, but the fire would not take. The feathers blackened, but did not ash. The trinkets grew hot, but did not melt. In the end, they were buried in a lead-lined chest, deep in the manor's foundations, and the wing was rebuilt with steel beams and modern plaster. Yet the crows did not leave. They roosted in the new oaks, watched the railway trains with unblinking eyes, and gathered each dawn not at the churchyard, but at the manor's eastern gable, as though waiting for a window that no longer existed to open again. Villagers claimed that on certain fog-shrouded mornings, always when the air was still and the river mist curled like breath, you could hear it. Not a cry, not a song, but the soft, rhythmic tap of small fingers against glass, as if testing whether the world still remembered how to listen. And in the village school, generations later, children still tell of the orphan who fed the crows, though they no longer know his name. They say he walks the marshes on winter nights, his coat stitched from black feathers, his pockets filled with lost things. They say if you leave a token on your window-sill, a button, a ring, a lock of hair, it will be gone by morning, carried away on silent wings to a place where the dead are not forgotten, but kept, not in graves, but in the space between heartbeats, in the pause before a name is spoken, in the hush that follows a lullaby's final note. The truth, if there is one, lies not in proof, but in the quiet unease that lingers when a crow lands too close, stares too long, and takes flight not with a caw, but with a sigh, like a remembered voice, almost familiar, almost calling you home.